The skiff was still breathing when Mara found it, an exhalation of steam through fractured hull plates, a sound like someone sobbing into a handkerchief translated into metal. A ribbon of cold air spilled from the gash, carrying the sharp chemical tang of coolant and something else, softer and impossible, a scent that made Mara's throat tighten, like ozone and rain and the memory of lullabies she had no name for. She kneeled in the crusted snow, glove fingers tracing the arc where the craft had kissed the ice and ripped, and heard a quiet, wet sound beyond the wreckage, a body, or what passed for one, trying to fold itself small for warmth. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He looked nothing like the images in the classified briefings Mara had once translated, those schematic silhouettes that hung on lab walls like forbidding constellations. Thalen was luminous, in a way that embarrassed light, skin that caught the twilight and held it like a secret, veins of soft pulse blue running beneath translucent tissue, a shape at once too delicate for survival and too stubborn to die. One limb was snapped at an angle that no bone should survive. Another had burned into a curious lattice of crystalline filaments that mocked human fractures. His head, if head it was, tilted as she brushed snow from his eyes, and for a single breath the irises flared, communicating not fear, but an ancient, weary calculation. Mara's hands moved before she chose them to. Training made them efficient. Gloves, sealant, provisional sutures woven with a wire finer than thread. Grief made them certain. In the months after her brother's ship went missing, after the memorial plaque and the legislative coldness that followed, Mara had slept inside labs and woken to the hum of freezers and centrifuges. Tools were the language she trusted. Thalen's skin glowed under her lamp, his fractures knit reluctantly as she threaded the crystalline filaments with careful fingers that remembered how to coax life back into broken things. He breathed, shallow and irregular, and when his chest rose, a scatter of bioluminescent specks drifted like moths from his collar. "You're not," she started, then laughed once, self-mocking and sudden. "No one believes me now." She had papers to write, tenure reviews to worry about, the sterile reputation of the Blackford Xenobiology Institute to protect. She also had the memory of a brother's last photograph, a vacuum-swathed smile, and a promise she hadn't spoken aloud, that she would not let meaning evaporate from the universe if she could help it. Hiding an alien envoy was not in any handbook, but neither was letting a living creature be ground into a government program. He woke with her voice and the scent of her hair woven into whatever dream thoughts crossed the luminous networks of his mind. His fingers, long, tapered, too elegant for gloves, curled around hers, and the contact was a pinprick of static that traveled up her arm and made images bloom under her skin. A sky the color of bruises, a fleet of ships like floating gardens, faces that were not faces, but gardens trimmed in living light. She staggered, a gasp that fogged her breath into stars, and he tightened his hold as if to anchor both of them. "Do you understand me?" she asked, because asking questions was what preserved sanity in a world of new catastrophes. Thalen made a sound that she realized was laughter and grief braided together. His voice, when it found language, because his species had a language of touch, of shared memory, and a spoken aspect that tasted like wind over copper, was musical and utterly honest. "You hear much more than you think, Mara Kestrel." He said her name with a softness that made her skin prickle. "You have the hands of a healer and the hollow of someone who knows loss. Why hide me?" "Because the world would not stop at repair," she wanted to answer, Because inside her, something burned with the need to choose differently than the institutions that had used people like her brother as numbers and then erased them. But what she said was smaller, tactical. Because if Director Voss gets to you, they won't ask questions, they will dissect them. The name arrived in her mouth like a rock pulled from a river. Director Voss, a man whose reputation carried the cold efficiency of someone who thought national security could be built on the backs of other people's grief. Voss had been the specter in Mara's nightmares, hands that took and never gave back. He led the task force that conflated curiosity with conquest, and rumor had it he had convinced the parliament to allow quasi-legal seizures of any non-human tech found within Earth's borders. Fallon's arrival here could, with the wrong hands, become the opening chord of a longer war. She looked at him, really looked, peeling aside the alien luminescence to see the minuscule signs of sentience that mirrored her own species' gestures. The way his nostrils fluttered when he smelled a familiar chemical, the way his eyelids crinkled when he tried to force a human expression. He blinked wetly, and, in a decision she did not register as conscious, she scooped him up, pressed him against her chest like contraband worms, and began the walk back toward Blackford. The town was a cluster of research trailers and municipal grit, a place that called itself a community but handed its inhabitants survival by the month. Mara moved fast, breath clouding in the thin air, rerouting her small field comm to send false coordinates and jam the patrol drones until she could slip into a back alley that smelled of burnt coffee and diesel. She had 40 minutes, maybe less, before the lab's security nodes pinged an anomaly. 40 minutes to convert a supply locker into a triage bay, to coil power conduits under a rug, to create a face for the being who could not yet speak for himself. At the edge of her apartment, a small modicum of domestic normality, an antique kettle, a worn copy of a textbook with a dog-eared spine, made Mara feel ridiculous for the decision she had already made. The kettle whistled a thin, human tune as she set up a work area, passing the thermal blanket over Thalin's luminous shoulders and arranging trays of sterilized instruments. She found herself humming an old lullaby from when she was a child, one that her mother had used to trace constellations on her ceiling. It soothed the ache in her chest like rubbing a scar, and Thalin's small fingers traced the air above her wrist in reply, following the rhythm with a slow, curious mimicry. "You're an envoy, aren't you?" she said aloud, half to him and half to the high windows that collected night and hid it. She wanted the diplomatic syllables to be something like a promise, that he had chosen contact, that his presence here implied negotiation rather than conquest. He coughed a laugh, and for a moment the room filled with the impression of crowded halls and silver light. "Envoy is a small word," he said. "I carry memory, Mara Kestrel. I carry witness. Sometimes that burden is as much a gift as it is a gift." Memory. The single word sang in her mind like a bell. She had read about memory-bearing species in university seminars, organisms that kept records of sociocultural trauma in their cells, organisms whose touch could unlock entire tapestries of recollection. The ethics around such sharing had always been theoretical, discussed in hushed panels and peer-reviewed footnotes. Mara felt a tremor of both professional excitement and deep personal alarm. If Thalin could share memories, he could prove or disprove everything governments wanted to know. He could show that humans had been kinder than rumor suggested, or far crueler. And she, already implicated by her choice to hide him, would be the keeper of that dangerous key. The first nights were a truce of small intimacies. Mara taught Thalin how to drink from a cup without breaking the ceramic with a delicate grip. He taught her how his species mapped mountains by the way sounds bent against them, a sensibility that made the walls of her flat seem to breathe. She forged a set of credentials for a non-existent researcher, rerouted a camera feed, and altered metadata until the lab's logs told a polite lie that no unauthorized entities had been in her bay. Every deception tightened the weave of her conscience, but when she caught Thalen looking at her with something like gratitude, the moral arithmetic simplified into survival and solace. He had no concept of betrayal in the cultural sense, only the raw, textured meanings of harm and help, and so his indebtedness to her was clean and sincere. That made it harder to see the consequences that lay waiting beyond her lit windows. Blackford's rumor mill was fastened to fear. Within 72 hours, a suppressed alert rotated through the command channels. An unidentified skiff had breached the atmospheric boundary and crashed near the outcroppings. Director Voss's task force would be probing past the horizon like predatory tide. Mara placed a small sensor array in the scrubland outside town to detect drones. And at night, when the sky burned with satellites and distant engines, she would lie awake, feeling the weight of her choice as if it were a physical object on her chest. Thalen's healing progressed in unruly bursts. Sometimes he would sleep and let the crystalline filaments realign into something close to human bone. Other times, he'd wake and convulse with the memories he'd absorbed from other worlds. Once, as she tended a re-sewn limb, he reached and laid his hand against the inside of her forearm. She saw, in an instant that felt like both an apocalyptic revelation and a small, intimate theft, the edges of a colony world where humans had been the invaders. Then, in the next heartbeat, the image flipped. Human hands teaching alien seedlings to drink. A clinic where mixed-species children learned to laugh. The flip made Mara's throat close. The complexity was a cruel joke. Humans could look monstrous and tender depending on the angle from which someone remembered them. "Why fear humans?" she asked, voice raw. Not because she needed to know. The answer had been a quiet background hum in every bureaucratic decision she had ever watched. She needed, perhaps absurdly, to hear it first from the one she had saved. Thalen's fingers trembled as he withdrew them from her skin. His luminous face folded into a shape that indicated shame, a sensation she had not expected him to experience. Because intention can be translated into harm by those who measure power rather than life, he said. Because promises become instruments when corners are convenient to cut. Because when you are small and beautiful, some humans think beauty is a resource. There was a precise, terrible truth to that. The world did measure beauty as resource. Genes, technologies, bodies, all cataloged and repurposed. Mara remembered the files labeled Project Mendel that her supervisor had shrugged away in conversation. Human cries for genetic miracles, ethical lines blurred by federal funding. She had thought then of the naive brilliance of scientists and the slow creep of justification. Now, with Thalen breathing under her lamp and the knowledge that his species' memory carried fresh proof of human tendency, the theory grew jagged teeth. The dilemma arrived like weather, urgent, inevitable. Stay and risk Voss's sweep that would transform Thalen into lab specimen and diplomatic precedent, or run, taking Thalen into exile where their existence would be a small, precarious rebellion. Each choice carried weight not only for them, but for the wider, unknowable web of species and planets. In her hands was a being who could validate fears and ignite wars. In her heart was a memory of a brother's absence, of the quiet rot of institutions that chewed up young lives. Her decision would not be scientific, it would be moral, and she felt every cell in her body hum with the knowledge that hiding an envoy would change everything. Night thickened outside her window. The sensor array beeped gently, the only sound that mattered. And Mara watched Thalen sleep, the glow of his skin turning the room into a private dawn. The dilemma closed around her like a fist. Protect him, and risk becoming what she hated. hand him to Voss, and become what she had sworn never to be, an enabler of harm that wore the garb of civic duty. She tightened her jaw, feeling grief and purpose spool together into something resolute and dangerous. She would not hand him over, not because of a deity or a manifesto, but because some things, living things, memories, fragile voices, were not meant to be cataloged into trophies. She would hide him, and to hide him, she would become a liar, a forger, a thief of surveillance. She would learn to speak the luminous language that looked like wind in reeds. She would learn the contours of his fears until she could name them in the dark. And if the cost was the safe, predictable life she had planned, then she would trade it for the ache of keeping another being alive. Outside, a single drone passed on its regular patrol, a quiet black dot against the indifferent stars. Inside, Mara fitted a new plate of patchwork seals over Thalin's wounds and swore, softly, with all the conviction of a person with nothing left to lose, that she would be the shelter he needed until they could determine, together, what kind of future deserved their names. He woke to the taste of her name and the scrape of metal against the inside of his skull, and for a moment the world was only the smell of antiseptic and the tremor of someone breathing too close. Mara was there, as she had been for nights and half-days, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and hands that smelled of solder and cinnamon. He blinked, and the room filled with the gravity of her face, so human, so defiantly ordinary, and the sensation of being cradled in an animal that could not explain its own tenderness. Mara caught the look and, absurdly, felt seen in the way she had not been since the funeral flares that followed her brother's disappearance. There is a particular loneliness that radiation-proof vaults and grant applications cannot cure, a quiet certainty that someone will not return. Thalin's gratefulness excavated that ache, but did not replace it. It left her raw, a gap shaped oddly like an alien palm. "You moved the sensor array farther north," he said finally, voice low enough that it trembled on consonants that tasted like frost. He was learning the cadence of human speech slowly, savoring each clipped syllable as if they had different flavors. "You risk detection to widen your safety net. That calculation, does it come from reason or from something that feels like home?" Mara smiled without humor. "Both," she said. "Sometimes the only reason that makes sense is what feels like home." He studied her, pupils widening in the soft lamplight. "Home," he said, "a foreign word made small and precious. We carry several, but on this planet, I have only what you offer." That exchange, tender and terrible at once, tightened the knot of responsibility in Mara's chest. It also shifted the geometry of what she was building. It was one thing to hide an alien body in a sealed bay. It was another to sustain a sentient being until their kind and their choices could be understood. She could already hear the lines forming in the committee rooms of Blackford. Ethics hearings that meant nothing. Voss's clipped sentences about national advantage. Those were futures other people would make for Thalin if she faltered. In the days that followed, the rhythm between them became an education in bodily politics. Mara taught Thalin discrete human behaviors, how to hide his phosphorescent patterns when the curtains were pulled, how to wrap his crystalline limb to avoid leaving telltale prints, how to make his voice steady when answering a door that did not open. Thalin, in turn, taught her a language that was not sound, but pressure and light. He pressed a fingertip to her palm and sent a fragment of memory that felt like the inside of an ocean. Pressure, undulating plant limbs, a city grown like coral around a sentience. The contact flooded her with something akin to vertigo and a sweetness that made loneliness shrink to the size of her fist. This intimacy made secrecy worse and better at the same time. She knew his physiology well enough to keep him healthy. He knew the architecture of her pain well enough to quiet it without trying to fix it. When she sat at her kitchen table and tried to reforge surveillance logs for a day when Voss would inevitably escalate, Thalen would sit across from her and his bioluminescence would make the coffee steam look like nebulae. "You should not live with so many locks," he said once, fingers trailing through steam as if feeling the heat had a texture he could read. "Locks are for things people fear will not belong to them." "You make it sound like theft," Mara said, but the accusation left her throat dry. Was she stealing his future when she kept him from those who had come to claim and categorize? Or was she defending him from the theft of something far worse? His autonomy, his memories, maybe even the right to die in his own way? Thalen's answer was a touch and an image. Hands, both his species and human, working together, repairing a vessel with laughing people dusted in ship soot. The memory was half a promise and half a melancholy. It unsettled her. The world was not neat. Humans were not entirely monsters, nor were beings beyond Earth purely victims. They had loved, harmed, adapted. The complexity did not lighten the stakes. It made betrayal hurt more, because it required a finer, more deliberate choice. On the fifth night, Mara got a call she had not been expecting. It was from Jaina, her younger sister, voice rubbed brittle by worry. "They're asking questions again, Mara," Jaina said. "Work is picking up chatter about the crash. You need to be careful. Voss's people—" She stopped, swallowed, the line fizzing with unsaid details. "I don't want to lose you. Not like that." The phone trembled in Mara's hand, the mechanical hold of the plastic somehow embodying the way life could be severed by a single bureaucratic signature. She felt the tug of ordinary love, family dinner plans, a sister's laugh on bad days, and the pull of something other that had no right to be compared. Protecting Thalen could bring danger not just to her, but to Jaina, whose job at a municipal clinic had small exposure to people in power. The revelation arrived with a weighty human clarity. Choices were not made in a vacuum. Any shelter she built would be precarious on the backs of other people. "Keep your head down," Mara said, the advice tasting of brittle bread. "Tell no one. If anyone asks, say you were out. Go to work. Don't get involved. I'll fix this." "It's not your call to fix," Jaina snapped, voice breaking. "It never has just been you, Mara." After the call, Mara sat with the echo of her sister's anger and the lamp's steady hum. She wanted to tell Jaina the truth, that she had an envoy in her living room, that the luminous being under her blanket looked at her like a mirror and a prayer. She wanted to explain that the world's moral calculus sometimes left people to make impossible choices. Instead, she wrapped a towel around Thalen's exposed filament and rehearsed ways to encrypt the drives with redundant shells. That night, the town carried the hint of storm. A fleet of drones hummed further off than usual, a mechanical murmur that pressed at the eaves of sleep. The sensor array blooped warnings as small signatures filtered over the horizon. Thalen woke from a dream, and his light quickened into a pattern that Mara read like a heartbeat staccato. He placed a warm hand on hers and sent a memory that was not his own, but had touched him. Images of a campus ringed with barbed fences and white-coated figures moving with surgical devotion. He looked at her with a new gravity. "They came before," he said. "Not all of them were monsters. They made laws, agreements. Then fear toggled. It made men take vows of efficiency. When efficiency is worshipped, safety becomes a liturgy of violence." Mara's skin crawled with recognition. The Project Mendel files hovered like bad weather, funding bids that promised longevity and the promise used as a lever. She thought of the committee back room where Voss had smiled and pressed a dossier into soft hands. She thought of her own lab, where a dark room held samples labeled only with number and date. In the unlit hours, she had imagined people in white coats hunched over bodies that did not consent. Thalen's hands trembled as he conveyed a memory of a different sort, An intimate scene where a child with two sets of eyes laughed in the rain, and people clapped because the child was a living symbol of possibility. The juxtaposition of the two memories cut through Mara like a blade of light. It produced in her a terrible calculus. Fear and hope can coexist, and either could be weaponized. Their sanctuary, already fragile, buckled under the weight of a new threat. A man she had once trusted, a colleague named Rook, who'd been fond of small bribes and larger favors, came to her pretend office under the pretense of asking after grant data. His smile was the exact angle of treachery, warm enough to disarm, practiced enough to conceal intent. Mara felt the air in the room change with his presence, like the tensing before music cuts out. "You're pale, Mara," Rook said, eyes flicking to the bay door as if expecting a surprise party. "Big things happening, you know. Voss is tightening the mesh. They want to centralize any foreign tech. They'll make an announcement soon. People like us should be ready to lend our expertise." Mara's mouth went dry. She answered with the sort of careful vagueness she had sharpened over the years. "I'm focused on finishing the Xeno survey update. Nothing unusual." Rook sighed and clenched his jaw in a way that revealed more than his words. "If they find something, you'll have the right call to make, Mara. Not everyone is brave enough." He tapped his temple with an index finger. "Bravery is overrated. Smart people survive." After he left, Mara stared at the closed door until the fluorescent hum of the building felt like the ocean. Rook's visit was a test she hadn't consented to. She imagined Voss's men sifting through her life like a metal detector, finding the small anomalies and following them to conclusions. She imagined Thalin in a lab, stripped of choices and reassembled into a model. The images kindled a cold fury that sat low in her belly. "It's getting closer," she told Thalin that night when she could no longer hold the tremor steady in her voice. She had not wanted to scare him, but lying to his luminous face felt like another harm. "People are talking. They'll search the region if they smell anything unusual." Thalen reached for her hand and pressed his forehead to her knuckles in a ritual of contact that made Mara dizzy with the intimacy of it. "You carry the risk and the hope in equal measure, Mara Kestrel," he said. "I owe you my life. The debts I can repay with memory if you ask. But there are things I would rather keep to myself until trust is not forced by fear." The room felt smaller as the words settled. He had offered her a choice shorn of coercion, a generosity of privacy in a moment when the world wanted to pry open both of them. It was a test of character they both had to pass. Could they resist the easy currency of information when it would save them but betray others? She thought of Jana, of Rook, of the community that fed and sheltered them all while being blind to the wider cosmos. She thought of Voss and his tidy, dangerous certitudes. Sometimes moral courage is the refusal to make oneself safe by making another unsafe. Mara felt that truth like a lance through the sternum. There would be no clean solutions. There would only be decisions whose consequences radiated outward like the shockwaves of a dropped stone. In the days that followed, Mara bolstered their defenses with the patience of a woman building a nest in a hurricane. She rerouted more feeds, bribed a cleaner with spare credits to swap hard drives, and installed a Faraday cage around the apartment's windows to muffle the wavelengths of intrusive drones. Thalen learned to mask his glow with a damp cloth and to breathe shallow when sensors crept close. He taught her to read the light of the night like a map. Certain satellites hum guilt, others hum benign gossip. The town became, in their mutual learning, a landscape of predatory and harmless things. Even as the practicalities accumulated, the emotional stakes deepened. They scraped at each other's loneliness like two magnets finding a strange but inevitable alignment. Mara would wake in the early hours to find Thalen on the balcony, absorbing the sound of the wind against the wire mesh. He would brush her hair back with fingers that left a trail of cool that was sweeter than any touch she had known. There was an odd, dangerous longing in both of them, for family in the midst of strangers, for the kind of fidelity that came from shared peril rather than pedigree. And yet, the shadow of Voss was never far. Each news broadcast, each increased patrol, each anonymous tip sent through rumor tightened the noose. They were living in a borrowed present, and the future, if it came at all, would arrive with men who measured the worth of other beings with clipboards. The dilemma persisted: to run now and gamble on exile, or to stay and risk being made into an exhibit in Voss's gallery of preventive power. Mara could dream of smuggling Thalen to a rumored sanctuary across the polar ridge, where a covert network of scholars once whispered about interspecies rights. But escape required resources she did not have, and allies she could not trust. Stay meant days of makeshift care and the slow accumulations of confidences that would be hard to sever. On a night when the aurora flared and the whole dome of sky looked painted in molten green, Mara sat with her back to the radiator and felt the truth like a physical thing. They had to choose, soon, and neither option was morally immaculate. Love, she was learning, was a kind of force that demanded risk, demanded calculus, and punished softness with the possibility of loss. She closed her eyes and felt Thalen's hand in the dark, his fingertips tracing the map of scars on her palm that no one else knew the meaning of. "We will choose together," he said, voice a vow that sounded like it might be older than any ceremony. "Whatever you decide, you will not be alone." Mara inhaled, tasting fear and resolve in equal measure. The night outside was a machine of indifferent stars. Inside, something fragile and luminous kept beating. They had each other in the small human ways: shared coffee, the brushing away of snow, a lullaby hummed at midnight. The world beyond those comforts might be merciless, but comfort itself had a kind of defiance. It asserted that life, no matter how compromised by fear and history, was still worth protecting. This was the push and pull, intimacy anchoring them, danger encroaching. The next move would not belong to either fully. It would belong to the moment when the choices of others crashed into their private geometry. And when that moment came, Mara knew the gravity of her decision would not just tilt their small world. It might set the first note of something larger, a chord that could become harmony or catastrophe. They came for the bioluminescent pattern first. It was a small thing. A student from the institute had noticed a flicker on the municipal CCTV near the bakery when the feed glitched, a luminous smear vanishing behind the alley. The student, eager for recognition, forwarded it to a private forum where journalists with an appetite for the speculative and state contractors with a taste for procurement mingled like scavengers. The image was grainy, insufficient for a headline, but enough to let imagination fill the gaps. Voss smelled opportunity. Voss was the sort of man who read rumor as instruction and acted on it with mechanical charity. Mara found out because Rook's office called her in under pretense of needing help with a preliminary report. The room smelled like stale coffee and the kind of paper that had been handled too often. Rook's face looked like a map of lies. He had rehearsed concern and found it leveled into something harder. "They asked for volunteers to audit the footage," he said. "It's being kept light, PR. But they're going to comb everything. If anything like that shows up in your sector, we'll have to explain. For the Institute." She watched him for a beat too long. Trust, she had learned, phrase in the small ways. False smiles, a hand too quick to pat. Rook's question was a probe. "I didn't work on that feed," she lied, because the safe lie was the only currency she had in public. Her pulse was a small drum against her ribs. She left the office with a pretense of casualness, and once outside she walked too fast until her lungs burned. The next morning, drones learned to navigate her nightmares. They hummed like wasps and made a path across the sky that was obvious to anyone who knew to look for a pattern. One of them dipped lower than the rest, as if uncertain, and its optics swept the alley where Thalen had first collapsed. Mara watched from her apartment window as a black speck carved a shadow into the world she had cobbled together. Her hand went cold around the kettle. She imagined the drone translating light into files, biometric signatures into a dossier that would be delivered with the certainty of a tax bill to Voss's desk. She could have run then. She could have taken Thalin under a blackout sky, thrown him across the ridge to the rumored sanctuary, and erased her own past in the process. Instead, she stood in the doorway and watched the drone's reflection pass through the polished steel of her spoons. She thought of Jana and the municipal clinic, where neat faces relied on neat beds. She thought of the elder neighbor who tended the park's saplings and cleaned snow off mailboxes. Escape would mean leaving safety in their hands, hands she could not fully trust not to hedge their bets for a payday or a nod from men like Voss. Thalin, when she told him, reacted as if the news were rain, and his kind had forgotten what wet felt like. They hunt in patterns, he said. They test the perimeter and measure the reaction. That is how they learn a territory. Mara wanted to laugh at the propriety of the statement. Instead, she felt the humor dry like old paint on her tongue. "Then we teach them to misread us," she answered, because misdirection was one tool she understood well. They layered noxious sense where her censor claimed neutrality, and fed false points to the open mesh with a script she had learned to write in emergency grants, a simulation of equipment failure that promised nothing to an inquisitive eye. It was a cheap theater, but sometimes cheap theater could fool a machine long enough for a human mind to look elsewhere. But humans were not machines, and Voss was never satisfied with choreography. He wanted a specimen, a policy, a precedent. He wanted to hold proof and shape it. He sent an emissary in the shape of paper. Subpoenas served to the Institute, thin legal knives that pried open funding accounts and personnel files. Rook delivered them with an apologetic handshake that tasted like a confession. "It's just routine," he said. "They're following a protocol. If there's nothing, nothing will come of it." Mara folded the papers until they made a small square and hid them under a pot plant she rarely watered. "Routine," she said, and the words sounded like a summons. The subpoenas meant a search, and a search meant men with surgical competence and no bedside manner. The system, the law and its soldiers, moved in steps and followed rules most of the time. It was the exceptions, the men who skirted rules for the sake of a theory, that she feared. Voss was the exception personified. Thalin's memory sharing grew stranger and more invasive as stress bled through him like dye through fabric. He began to dream in fragments that weren't always his. A child with a double bloom on her wrist. A ship so old it remembered the ocean by scent. Humans who had held a treaty and honored it until fear turned that honor into an experiment. He pressed these visions into Mara's palm with an insistence that felt like pleading. He wanted her to know, to feel the ways her species could be both tender and terrifying. Each shared memory was a weight placed in her chest, an alternative proof that humans had been both saviors and perpetrators across worlds. The multiplicity of their record made trust impossible to reduce to a simple choice. One afternoon, in the brittle light between storms, Jana found the wrong end of a conversation. She had come to town under the pretense of visiting Mara for coffee and stayed long enough to be useful as an alibi. She was sitting at the kitchen table, cutting coupons and humming, when a siren passed too low, and Thalin, convulsing from a sudden memory, shimmered through the curtain of his hiding cloth. Jana looked up, and her hand stilled as if frozen by a hand nobody had seen. "What on earth?" she began, the words curdling mid-air as Thalin, startled, drew back and his glow spilled like an apology. Mara's heart thudded. It was a small, private apocalypse. Jana's face took on the slow map of mutations. Disbelief, fear, then the raw, bristling hurt of a sister who felt betrayed. "You lied to me," Jana said. The phrase cracked the room like thunder. "You said there was nothing. You said—" "It's not like that," Mara started. She wanted to tell Jonna everything about the skiff, the lullaby smell, the way Thalen had clung to her like a life preserver. But the words shifted under her tongue like fish. She had rehearsed secrecy into the muscles of her body, and now secrecy rebelled, requiring sacrifices that tasted of rust. Jonna's hands moved in the space between them, palms up, like a person who was asking to be understood. If Voss finds out you hid something, someone, Mara, they will come for everyone you love. Her voice was small, edged with the brittle sorrow of someone who had already counted too many losses. Mara saw, in Jonna's eyes, all the lives that hinged on the lie. She saw children in the clinic, an elderly man with a failing hip, neighbors who exchanged sugar and curses. The shelter she had built suddenly had a dozen windows, and each one opened onto a life she had promised to protect. The weight of the promise was a new kind of pressure. She could not keep Thalen without endangering those she loved. She could not hand him over without violating what had become, impossibly, a covenant of tenderness. That night, the two sisters stood on opposite sides of a chasm made by choices. Jonna packed a small bag and left with a kiss that was both blessing and accusation. "Be careful," she said, and meant both caution and the plea that Mara not become the sort of person who could justify harm. The split with Jonna opened a living wound in Mara. Loneliness was no longer hypothetical. It had a voice that hummed at the edge of sleep. She found herself speaking aloud to a being who had never been human, and yet had become the repository of her moral life. "What if they take you?" she asked once. The question was less about losing Thalen than about losing the part of herself that had chosen mercy over policy. Thalen's answer was a memory pressed like a jewel into her palm. A courtroom not unlike those she had seen on the news, where people argued about the nature of rights and history unfolded like an accusation. In the memory, hands, both alien and human, reached for a child who was neither and both. They argued, they bargained, they chose technical definitions over tenderness. The child watched and later learned to distrust the sound of gavels. Mara's chest tightened around that image. The memory was a prophecy and a warning. If a system like Voss's seized Thalen, it would fold him into law's tidy violence. He would be objectified, catalogued, reduced to an exhibit of the state's benevolence. It would be a triumph of policy over personhood. She felt suddenly that she could bear the cold of exile, the hunger of flight, the ragged life of a fugitive, if it meant keeping Thalen out of that room. Outside, the drones looped like thoughts that would not resolve. Inside, Mara and Thalen wove a set of contingencies: a route across the ridge, dead drops of supplies, a network of whispered contacts that might or might not answer when called. The plan was half courage, half desperation. It required resources they did not have, and favors they had not earned. It would also require a deception of the worst order, asking strangers to risk what they could not predict for a cause dressed as a personal rebellion. The fractures multiplied. Rook's betrayal, real or likely, had put a price on their heads. Jonna's departure hollowed Mara out like the soft part of a fruit. The town's eyes, real and mechanical, scanned with a hunger that refused to be sated by ordinary cues. Secrecy had made them intimate and together. Secrecy was also the thing that could rend them apart. And yet, threaded through the rupture, something stubborn and luminous remained. In the small hours, Mara would find Thalen asleep on the couch, filament hand resting on her jacket like a benediction. She would trace the faint grooves of crystalline bone and feel beneath her fingertips a promise that was not yet made and could yet be kept. The fractures of this act were not only breaks, they were the seams from which something new might be stitched, if courage and luck could learn to be friends. They had secrets to keep and losses to mourn. The fractures would widen before they sealed, and each widening would demand choices that would be judged in public and in private. For now, in the brittle hush before decisions hardened into action, Mara held the luminous hand and let the silent electric current of complicity hum between them. Equal parts love and rebellion, equal parts fear and resolve. They came at dawn, not with the thunder Mara feared, but with the precise, surgical patience of those who thought themselves entitled to inevitability. A convoy of unmarked vans rolled into Blackford like a thought becoming action, and men with logbooks and steady faces moved in their orbit, asking polite questions that had teeth. Mara watched them from her curtained window while the town yawned awake, ramen steam rising and children with bundled hoods arguing about which bus to catch. The ordinary world pressed up against extraordinary danger, like two skins touching and not quite realizing the heat between them. Thalin slept with his hand pressed to the floor as if feeling the heartbeat of the building. Mara could not bear the thought of someone waking him to the clink of a key in the wrong lock. She packed in silence. Spare batteries, the forged credentials she had burned and reprinted so many times they had softened at the edges. A folded map where routes were annotated in a code only she and one other person might understand. There would be no perfect exit, only a sequence of choices that hoped to outpace destiny. She wrapped Thalin in the dullest of coats and learned, for the first time, the precise weight of a decision made in another person's stead. "You know what will happen if they catch you," she said, because sometimes speaking terror aloud made it less monstrous. The words skittered across the kitchen tile and into the kettle's steady patter. Thalin opened his eyes and let the lamplight fill them like a small ocean. He did not flinch at the vocabulary of doom. His species had language for endings thin as paper and thick as stone. "I am not afraid to die," he answered. "I am afraid to be unmade, reduced to a file, to a skin in a laboratory. I am afraid for the children who might be born with two heritages and no sanctuary." The image of mixed children, ones whose genes might be coveted like prizes, was a cruelty that sat between them like a third presence. Mara had been careful to keep her voice steady, but Thalin's words carved hollows in her like winter wind. There was no way to argue with the moral arithmetic he presented. In a cage, memory bearers could become repositories for interrogation. In exile, they could survive, hidden and whole. They moved through the building like ghosts. The radiator hissed a complaint and then was quiet as they slipped down the stairs with a borrowed stroller and a bag of tools. Mara's fingers trembled when she rifled through the pocket of a coat she had not worn in months and found, folded neat as a promise, a small photograph of her brother as a child. Hair wild, grin full of future. The photograph steadied her. She tucked it into a pocket and did not look back. Exfil had always been an academic exercise until it was a cold reality. Timing, routes, decoys. They traveled through alleys that smelled of frying oil and rain, past the municipal clinic where Jana had worked and where Mara's sister might be reoriented by the sight of men who were not her neighbors. The van was waiting at the edge of town, a hulking shape with its engine idling like a beast. Mara considered bolting into the trees, following fissured storm gullies to an old smuggler's path she had heard about in student gossip. Instead, she climbed into the passenger seat and let the driver, an old contact who owed her for a favor years ago, give a curt nod. They were 3 turns from the ridge when the world narrowed to a single mechanical cry. The drone's acoustic signature, unmistakable. And then the van's tires grinding against ice as lights strobed like daggers. A line of black-suited men erupted from the roadside like ants summoned by sugar, and Voss's voice crackled over a speaker as if the universe had been reduced to a bureaucrat's ringtone. "Stand down," it said. The order carried the flat certainty of laws made by men who never considered how fragile the things they governed might be. Mara braked. Her mind, trained to measure things in millimeters and probabilities, calculated escape routes even as her heart thudded a reckless rhythm. There was a sidetrack, a half-collapsed bridge, and an old snowcat stashed under tarps. Options brittle as twigs, but worth trying. She could feel Thalen's fingers knot in the coat near her hip, as if holding on to the last visible thing that could be called home. "Go," he whispered, and the single syllable carried a gravity that buckled the world. He knew what bravery cost in pure currency. He had seen cities barter their children for peace and had watched treaties become inventories. He had offered her a way out with the smallest of words because he understood the geometry of sacrifice in a way that made human courage simple and awful. Mara didn't hesitate. She swung the wheel toward the bridge and felt the van lurch into a trajectory she hoped their pursuers would not anticipate. Men shouted, boots fell, and for a breath the northern air became full of human noise. The snowcat, improbably intact, groaned and came to life beneath a tarp as if answering an ancestral call. Mara cut power and leapt from the van with a bag and a shivering envoy pressed to her chest. She could hear the drone's optics whine like a creature sensing pain. Their flight was not cinematic. It was a ragged, close-run thing that required every small, unglamorous talent Mara possessed. Coaxing reluctant engines, sliding behind cliffs, making the quiet gestures that meant hide in emergency. Voss's men were efficient, but they were not gods. They moved like men who expected a map to guide them, and Mara's improvised path was the kind of cruelty that made maps useless. They crested a ridge, and for a moment the world was only wind and white. Thalen, cramped and luminous, whispered the memory of a ship leaving a nursery planet, hands waving, small flowers tied to fingertips. The memory was a benediction and a blade. Mara clung to it like an offering and felt the edges of her resolve harden. They were not safe, not yet. The sanctuary on the other side of the ridge was rumor given teeth by hopeful scholars and greedy opportunists alike. It required crossing territory that had no mercy for the ill-equipped. Their supplies were scarce, their pursuers were numerous. But as they descended into the scree toward a hidden ravine where a sympathetic old professor had stashed an emergency cache, Mara saw something she had not expected. The luminous pattern of Thalen flared in the snow like a small dawn, and the sight pierced her with a fierce, ridiculous joy. "You could have left me," Thalen said later as they crouched beneath a tarp, breath fogging in the cold like smoke. "You did not." Mara's laugh was a cracked thing. "You could have fought," she said. "You chose not to." He touched her cheek with a fingertip that left a faint, cooling trail like moonlight. Fighting would not have saved you. They were close enough now to the cache to smell the oil and cloth within, to feel the human generosity that had been wired in small kindnesses by people who did not know what they were protecting. An old woman in the reeds had once taught Mara to mend nets by night. Now those small skills stitched them into concealment. They ate cold stew by lamplight and exchanged memories deliberately. Thalen sharing scenes of law courts that had both redeemed and condemned. Mara offering a human history lesson in broken promises and the stubborn, luminous acts of ordinary people who resisted. But redemption demanded more than escape. It required a claim. Voss's men would not stop hunting a prize, and that prize would be used as a tool to reorder law and precedent. Mara realized, with the clarity of someone who had watched institutions devour individuals, that exile alone would not be victory. They needed leverage, proof not of Thalen's alienness, but of humanity's capacity to do better. Thalen could offer memories that would become testimony, uncanny, unassailable glimpses of human kindness amid cruelty. If those memories could be put into hands that chose compassion over policy, they could alter the calculus that made men like Voss comfortable. The thought was political and intimate at once. It demanded risk in scales that made Mara dizzy. They could release a sequence of memories to a trusted network, scholars, a few journalists with integrity, a coalition of exiles who had opposed colonial abuses on other worlds. Those memories could humanize the unknown, complicate Voss's neat narrative, and present the public with a choice too morally raw to ignore. Mara prepared to be the instrument of that plan, and in doing so, she prepared to be betrayed by the very mechanisms of her profession, the press, the law, the networks of favor. But she also prepared to be generous in a way that might save more than one life. "You will share them?" she asked, the cold making her voice small. "If you ask," Thalen replied, and his bioluminescence softened like a promise. He reached for her hand and pressed one luminous palm against the other, and in that touch she felt an opening like the thawing of deep frost. Memories flowed that were not only tragic, faces lit by laughter at communal tables, hands from different species building a windmill, a treaty signed with tears and an offering of seeds. The images complicated Voss's equation like a new variable in a stubborn theorem. Their flight became a negotiation with fate. They planned a broadcast, a curated release of memory fragments to the independent networks that still believed in public scrutiny. It was theater, no less risky for being dramaturgical. Mara would be the facilitator, the scientist who vouched for the authenticity of what Thalen offered. In return, those networks would provide the spectacle of public opinion, the only defense left against men who thought themselves above consequence. Choosing to broadcast was choosing exposure. It meant giving Voss the exact thing he wanted, attention, but it reframed attention as scrutiny and humanity as a stakeholder, not a resource. It was a gamble that hinged on the inconvenient moral reflex of crowds, that when confronted with a creature both alien and achingly familiar, people might choose kinship over conquest. On the night of the broadcast, with the northern lights a halo above them and the ravine holding its breath, Mara fell asleep with her head on Thalen's shoulder and woke with the taste of snow in her mouth and the sound of engines far off. The feed went live with hands that trembled and a voice that did not belong to any one species. Thalen shared, and the memories wrapped around the world like vines, impossible to dismiss as fiction because they were held in the palm of a living witness. When Voss's men arrived, they found empty tarps and the smell of too strong coffee. The broadcast had done what it was meant to do. It blurred the lines between enemy and person, turned a file into a face, and gave people the desperate, dangerous choice of seeing the other as kin. It did not end the threat. It did not guarantee safety, but it changed the terms of the argument. As they watched the initial shock ripple across networks, Mara and Thalen sat in the hollow of a ruined pump house and held each other the way people who had been spared hold the shape of their survival, tenderly and with a readiness to grieve. Outside, men still moved in patterns of pursuit. Inside, they had claimed their truth. Thalen's glow was dim from exhaustion, but in its dimness, there was a steady, uncompromising light. "You risked everything," he said, voice near lost in the draft. "You taught me what to risk," Mara answered. "You showed me what we might be if we let each other be whole." He smiled, a slow, luminous rearrangement of features, and laid a finger against her lips as if sealing the truth with a kiss. "Then, Mara Kestrel, we have already begun." They were fugitives with a manifesto of memory. The rescue had become revolution by another name, a claim that life was not inventory, that memory was not commodity, that love, messy, defiant love, could be a political act. The cost would be the rest of their lives, exile, the loss of families, the constant threat of being hunted. But as dawn pushed the darkness away, revealing the raw edges of the world, Mara felt something in her chest that no subpoena could reach, a certainty that choice mattered, that mercy could be an engine of change. She did not know what the future would demand of them, whether Voss would find a way to turn public sentiment into policy, or whether some hidden tribunal would attempt to undo their broadcast with its own theater. But she knew this: she had chosen with her eyes open, with an understanding of the harm and the hope. And beside her, Thalen, luminous, dangerous, scandalously human, had chosen back. The sirens that still threaded through the morning could not drown that small, stubborn thing. They rose, gathered what little they could not leave behind, and walked toward a ridge that led to exile and possibility. Each step was a promise and a peril. Each breath was a claim. They moved together, not because they were safe, but because they had decided, in the quiet and among the snow, that saving one another was worth the surrender of everything else. They found a small community waiting beyond the ridge, not an army, but a ring of hands: scholars, farmers, old networkers, and a few journalists. Someone had left a note: memory worth protecting. Mara thought of Yana, of Rook, of every ordinary kindness that had felt like treason when practiced in secret. Here, it returned as shelter. Thalen settled into a makeshift clinic, luminous but quieter, his glow learning the pattern of bread and rain. Mara taught classes in hidden rooms about consent and memory, arguing gently that witness should be guarded, not owned. Sometimes at night, they walked along a frozen stream, the world thin with cold and bright with stars. Conversation slid between them like well-placed stones. Small jokes, confession, the uncomfortable truth of grief. Mara taught Thalen to read human faces. He taught her to listen to silence. The broadcast rippled through courts and parliaments. Voss became a marginal outrage in op-eds and in private memos, forced to answer to a world that had seen what he would prefer hidden. Laws bent and committees convened. Some changes were theater, some were real. The sanctuary codified rights for memory bearers, small and precarious, a first seam in an enormous tear. Mara received a short transmission from Yana: "Come home when you can." The words were both forgiveness and a tether. They shared a life made of slow recoveries, public testimony, and the steady negotiation of intimacy. Thalen learned to hide parts of his light for surprise birthdays. Mara learned to ask for help. When children from nearby settlements came with curious questions, Thalen showed them images of interspecies picnics, of seeds shared, and taught them a song that made the darkness feel smaller. The world did not unmake itself, but something quietly shifted. The language of rights grew roots. Mara would wake some mornings and watch Thalen tend a garden of windflowers, his fingers careful as if painting mercy into petals. In those small acts, they rebuilt what had been broken. They did not stop fearing, but fear sat beside them like an old companion, less hungry when given tea. On the last night of that first winter, the aurora unfurled above the camp like a benediction. Thalen lifted his hand, and the light in his veins braided with hers, a quiet language of belonging. Mara thought of her brother's photograph and felt the world hold them.